I am convening the ministers in the security cluster today to make sure that we keep a close eye on these acts of wanton violence and find ways of stopping them, he said in a post on Twitter. And he continued to say there can be no justification for any South African to attack people from other countries. An eyewitness to the murder of a South African man in Coronville, Johannesburg, recounts his version of events, of which we'll give you much later in the course of the program. But also, this is a basis of our discussion here this morning, what is really happening in South Africa. We'll show you also a statement from the Kenyans who are living in diaspora as well. So we want just to head over to our panelists this morning and discuss the xenophobia in South Africa, where there seems to be a systemic problem with this. So we want to know, where did it begin, where we headed? Kenyans also there living in fear who are in South Africa as well. Let's just begin with you, Irungu Houghton. First of all, there seems to be something deeper than what we are actually seeing happening currently in South Africa. Could we just peel back the layers?
What we're learning from the news of the last 24 hours essentially is that xenophobia has raised its ugly head again in South Africa. As you've mentioned, several people have been arrested. I think it's about 70 people at the moment. It's happening not just in one city, but across several cities. It's not new for South Africa. We've seen at least 10, 15 years of xenophobia. But I think the context of this has to be placed within two specific issues. The first is the legacy of that country in terms of apartheid and xenophobia expressed as racism and segregation of the majority of those people. The second one is what's happening more globally, which is that we are increasingly seeing populist leaders who are using demagogic language to divide populations, particularly on issues of color. Yes. So while we look at South Africa, we need to look at Europe, we need to look at the new laws that are emerging there in terms of anti-immigrant laws, or what they call the ghetto laws in Denmark, and we can talk a bit more about this. But we also need to look at what's happening in the United States of America, where you have a leader in charge of that country that has no problems calling out and demanding the deportation or proposing the deportation of Democrat leaders, yes, simply because they are of people of color. And one of them, of course, is a sister that was in Kenya for a while, a Somali congresswoman. So I think we need to look at it in that context, that actually what we're seeing is a destruction of a liberal democratic values in countries that are able to absorb diversity and inclusion. Let me start there, and I'm sure my panelists will want to pick it up.
All right, let's hear from Dr. Hassan Khanenje.
Good morning, Dibao.
Good morning to you.
There are a number of ways to look at it. And of course, people who've lived in South Africa, like Professor Kangwanja, later on is probably going to give us some of the inside meat. Prof, Sewubona. Yes, but I look at this problem in South Africa as it is part of what is going on around the world, but it's also uniquely South African. And as Houghton has mentioned, part of it is the legacy of apartheid and the trauma that caused. But perhaps what is more than that, and anyone who has interacted with lots of South Africans, it's apartheid not only kept Black South Africans apart or away from the white South Africans, it actually kept South Africans in general from other Africans. And when you interact with South Africans, you realize they have very little knowledge of actually the struggle or the contribution of other Africans to their own liberation. And so anytime they see other Africans coming there, they think they're probably coming to take their goodies that they worked so hard to get. So there is already a notion that there is an Africa and there is South Africa. And in fact, some of them actually always think they are not Africans. Number two, you have the black empowerment programs that were initiated by the post-apartheid government. I think it did not do enough, or it has not been able to accomplish enough. And because of the apartheid legacy ensured that large masses of black populations in particular, and colored, they did not have access to good education. So after the apartheid, there's still large pools of those who did not have access. Now, with the opening up of South Africa, you have literally millions of Africans actually streaming into South Africa. Some for good job opportunities, but others because some neighboring states were actually collapsing. So that had a way of, for instance, increasing competition for whatever resources and job opportunities are available. Now, overall, you find that a lot of Africans who are going to South Africans also went there as technocrats, and they were seen to be taking some good jobs. Now, those who are not going there as technocrats, they were also ready and willing to take jobs that some South Africans that were not willing to do, much like what happens between Latin American immigrants in the United States. And so, again, that creates a sense of unfair competition, that, of course, builds into xenophobia. Number three, the fact that up to now, in fact, part of the rise of Malema, who actually does not support the attacks against other Africans, is very Pan-Africanist, is the sense that the government has not done enough, for instance, in making sure you're transferring wealth from minority white to the black majority. But the challenge is there are only so many goodies to actually be able to share. Of course, with regard to the land issue, is still something that is very hotly contested in South Africa. I'm not seeing it going the Zimbabwe way because of just the realities of how South Africa is and how actually the world works, unless the economy, South Africa wants to collapse. Finally, I would say you have also the idea of blaming the other. Now, we know that South Africa is one of the most crime-prone countries, actually, on this continent. Most people I know who've lived there, they've experienced crime in one way or another. And it's interesting because while some people jokingly call Nairobi Nairobi, a lot of people have not been robbed in Nairobi, but a lot of even people who are visiting South Africa have actually found themselves, especially in a number of places, going through that. So you have both the feeling of being dispossessed, of losing their country, but at the same time, the economic conditions of a lot of South Africans have not significantly improved in a way that can actually change that. But also what is worse is you find that even those educated South Africans that you meet out there, they really don't seem to embrace other Africans. As for instance, when you go to an average African country where, they may have some issues, but a lot of times they just don't see you as, someone who is a foreigner. So there also going to need to be some education, actually, by the post-apartheid government to teach South Africans about the importance of living with other Africans, as well as understanding the history, where they're coming from, and the fact that their own national anthem was modeled along the Tanzanian national anthem. It sounds exactly the same. And why? Because the liberation movement, the headquarters used to be based in Tanzania. And so we need actually to be able to address some of these things apart from what is going on around the world, because there are certain things which are uniquely South African.
Thank you. Right. Ahmed Dashi.
Well, I'm glad you jumped over my other colleagues over so that I can have something original to say before it is said. The clinical psychologist aspect of this is important to discuss by the panelists. The great and late W.E.B. Du Bois, the American scholar, wrote about double consciousness. The West Indian philosopher Frantz Fanon, who's also a clinical psychologist, wrote about these issues of race and otherness. And I think that at the very top of the analysis, that flower of understanding how race has really killed, to a certain extent, the body politic of the South African experience, and how the experiment of trying to transform South Africa from apartheid to a modern nation state is causing a lot of trouble. Debal, the economy of South Africa is not fair. 85% of the economy is owned by people who are not of African descent. This is because for 300 years it has been like that. Nelson Mandela brought in liberal democracy as a way of using the state to empower the African community in South Africa. I don't think the economic empowerment issue has reached a level where that the South African citizen can feel comfortable about other people coming into their countries and dealing with the issues of employment and unemployment. That's one factor. I think the second factor that's really important, Debal, is leadership in the South African elite. And I saw the Deputy Commissioner of Police speaking about this issue, and it was an appalling way in which he was speaking. He took the side of the looters, he took the side of the people who were breaking the law. The South African government must know that it is a leading African state, and it must be able to show by example that it can, the rule of law, crime and punishment, the issues that are around this society must be held up to the highest possible standards. It is very unfortunate that the president of South Africa, Mr. Ramaphosa, is who's from the trade union movement, has said something on Twitter. What has happened to these Africans needs an address to the nation by the president of South Africa. It does not need a message on Twitter. Most of the countries on this side of the continent, Debal, have paid with treasure, armor, and lives, and have fought for freedom in South Africa. And we are owed by our sister country an explanation as to the bad behavior of these rotten group of people. It's not the majority of the South African people. I know them well. I've seen them everywhere. I've talked to them, have friends who are from South Africa. But it's not acceptable that this has happened to people from the rest of Africa. And I believe that the Minister of Foreign Affairs of this country should call the South African ambassador to Harambee Street there, and ask him or her what is going on there. And I think our ambassador from Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda, we have to act as East Africans and recall our ambassadors from South Africa as a protest to what is happening there, because this has continuously happened for the last 15 years. We're sick of it, we're tired of it, and the South African state ought to maintain law and order in their country.
Right, Dr. Mustafa.
Yeah, Debal, the xenophobic violence in South Africa is appalling. And it is appalling mostly because most of the African countries actually help South Africa in its liberation struggles. We don't need to overemphasize on that particular issue.
Yes.
And it's more structural, Debal. South Africa has become a very violent society. 20,000 people were murdered last year in South Africa in various cases of homicide and others. That translates to over 50 people every day. Now, when it comes to sexual violence, up to 100 women are raped on a daily basis in South Africa. So it is a major problem in South Africa. Now, what happened here? Irungu Houghton has explained the whole issue of apartheid, how the African populations were dehumanized, and the African population has come back with that inferiority complex and is attacking fellow Africans. They don't see how the whites in South Africa have been the cause of the trouble, economic inequalities and all that. When South Africans were given independence, you know, the Boers said, you know, give them the parliament, let's keep the banks. And that's what they did. And so this huge inequality has come back to haunt South Africa, and unfortunately the South Africans are releasing the violence on innocent people instead of calling for economic reforms that is going to benefit South Africans, the black South Africans. You can see violence is spreading, and in Nigeria they've started banning South African-based businesses, the MTN and the others. So South Africa will pay a heavy price for what they are doing or what the government is not doing to prevent xenophobia in South Africa. Johannesburg, Debal is overtaking San Salvador in El Salvador by becoming the new murder capital of the world.
Right, interesting. And let's hear from Peter Kagwanja. You stayed and also worked in South Africa for a long time. You can actually give us now a first-hand experience of what is really happening, peel back the layers, and also give us a bit of history.
I started communicating the issue of South Africa to the Kenyans around 2008. By that time, I was the executive director in the think tank that founded Apartheid. It's called Human Sciences Research Council, but which after the fall of Apartheid, it was supposed to help reconstruct the new Pan-Africanism. And therefore, most of us went to South African, which that time was appearing like the Mecca of New Africa. It was the Mecca of New Africa because at that time, South Africa was championing the cause. This is under Thabo Mbeki and Nelson Mandela. And therefore, we went there, and I'm talking about we because we were a huge African population, that went there of professionals. I cannot count the number of Kenyans. When we would meet at the embassy, you'd think it's the University of Nairobi meeting. When Professor Anyang' Nyong'o would come to speak to us, at that time, he was basically speaking to an intelligentsia there. That's how attractive South Africa was. But South Africa struck me very quickly as a paradox. And I did not miss this paradox because to many of us, we started describing South Africa as a white tip on a black continent. It was a white tip on a black continent because South Africa was as white as it gets, perhaps more white, perhaps whiter than any other white nation. At the same time, it was black because the vast majority of its population are black. But we didn't know how deep the whiteness had penetrated the blackness of South Africa. And therefore, you come to the second characteristic of South Africa, which is that they saw the Africans as the other. So they would call us Makwere-kwere. Makwere-kwere are those who speak the other language. And if they greet you, kona puti, and you don't answer, then of course you are a victim. Particularly if you are walking around some corners of Johannesburg, they realize that you are a Makwere-kwere, because you cannot answer the greetings back. Gujani puti, you can't answer that. Then you are in trouble. So at that level, therefore, we have two forms of violence. There is white violence on black, which was characteristic of apartheid, but thereafter we have black violence on black. The South Africans themselves would fight violently. The Zulus, the Xhosas, and the others would always fight. But then this violence after apartheid was now visited on African migrants. And that is the nature of violence. But then I think my colleagues have explained in depth what is the root cause of this violence. South Africa is, somebody used to say that what happened in Zimbabwe was a baby's breakfast compared with what is going to happen in South Africa. And the prediction was based on the fact that a study done by the International Crisis Group, which I presided over in terms of research, found that about 85% of all the land in South Africa, we are talking about arable land in South Africa, was owned by less than 10% of the population, and that 10% of the population was white. Yeah. And therefore, the Africans have no similar areas of retreat like the rest of Africa, where when you lose a job, you can go back to the farm. When the vast majority of the population cannot get jobs in the industry or in the service area, they would retreat to some form of farming, at least to make ends meet. In South Africa, you don't, because even the land that is reserved for the Africans is barren or over-cultivated and over-utilized. And therefore, the transformation from apartheid to democracy was basically what was described by one political scientist, or actually a historian, as flag independence versus economic independence. And South Africa is a typical case where flag independence did not translate into economic independence. And it's not a surprise the younger generation, like Julius Marema and others, are now prioritizing economic liberation as part of that. If I have ever seen a poverty-stricken community anywhere in the world, it is not the African Americans. It is the South African Africans. And I'm saying so because I would visit, for the entire stay in South Africa, I visited the townships at least twice for a period of almost 10 years.
Yes.
And I had I still have very many friends and colleagues. Some were fellows and associates in my institute. David, David is there. There are others, and we have co-authored books and articles with the South Africans. But you can never visit their home because it is very insecure. So I remember my wife was lured to visit with a friend, and she came back to describe to me how she made it through not just Soweto. There's Mamelodi, is another one near Pretoria, and she had to wear a big long cap. Then of course you look rough a little bit. Then you wear thick glasses, and you take the gait. You walk like the way they walk. Otherwise,
there's a song by Miriam Makeba about that actually.
Yes, so you have to take the gate so that you walk through that township without being harassed in Mamelodi. So what is the big point? The big point is that even as we speak, South Africa is still a paradox. It's the leading Pan-African nation in terms of investment, in terms of championing African interests. I don't know any other country on the continent which has allowed a voice down South Africa in articulating Pan-African issues. I was in Sudan last week. Who is heading the UNAMIS force? It is Kingsley Mamabolo. And Mamabolo is one of the authors of Modern South Africa. He is now the chief UN representative in the Horn of Africa in regard to peacekeeping that country. Who is championing the peace in Sudan? It is Thabo Mbeki, the first president of South Africa. Who led the delegation here for democracy in Kenya? The Obasava mission for the African Union. It's Thabo Mbeki.
Let me just interrupt you a little, because I think you're raising a very important point. How is it that such a modernized state and society, or rather, let me put it this way, how is it that such a modernized state can produce such mayhem in society?
Can I say something about
that? And just on that one, I think there's a couple of things that are lessons for us. We can invest in infrastructure. We can invest in a modern economy. But if it does not deal with the issue of inequality, then you will produce this sense of marginalization and violence. 61% of, just to go back to, I think the facts that you were giving us a little bit, Mustafa, 61% of South Africans actually think that the problem with South Africa is migrants. 61%. 61%, roughly 62% think that migrants, and let me just be a bit more political on this one, migrants, refugees, and expatriates, right? Because sometimes we tend to define people differently. But that expatriates, so these are people coming from Somalia, coming from Nigeria, coming from Mozambique into South Africa, that they are responsible for all the crime in South Africa, right? Now, what kind of a society is that? And what is the lesson for Kenya as we begin to urbanize, as we begin to destroy the urban-rural connections, that we may be producing the seeds of a society that is intolerant, that is divided, and that is violent?
Rungo, I think both of you have hit on something very important. The really fundamental question is whether or not Africans, people who are not from South Africa, can be able to participate in the economic pie in South Africa in a peaceful way without being pressured by other citizens. And I think that the history of South Africa has to come up. Every country in this region, and probably Kenya was at the tail end, Somalia, Tanzania, Malawi, Mozambique, all the frontline states. Kenya played its part under Munyo Oyaki. Munyo Oyaki was one of the staunchest anti-apartheid people in this country and fought off any kind of South African investment. He opposed Charles Njonjo in cabinet. So we know that Kenya stood with the frontline states. And I tend to think that Debal and the rest of the panelists, that what is happening in South Africa is not acceptable. It's intolerable. We know that there are no more Africans on this continent who have the baton of anti-racism and Pan-Africanism more than our South African brothers. And that's precisely because of the experience of what South Africa has been through. They're at the vanguard of that. I understand that. But what I am talking about, or trying to put on the table, is whether or not the state in South Africa and its political elite really understand how we, as the rest of Africans, feel about this. We feel really upset about it because that's the last place where we would expect this kind of trouble to happen. And the lightness, the unbearable lightness of it all is when the President Ramaphosa there and the leaders of that country haven't really come out and said this is not acceptable. The moral leadership in South Africa has to come up and say this is not acceptable. We have to call out these bad elements within South African society and say, look, they carried our burden at one time, and they carried it when they had nothing. When Africa was going through structural adjustment programs, the West was really on our case, and these countries stood firm on the issues of apartheid. South Africa needs to show us that that was not all in vain, and that it has a responsibility, it's a responsibility to protect our citizens.
Let me explain what is happening now. Now, I started by saying that South Africa is a paradox, because in whatever dimension you look at it, South Africa is the lead Pan-African nation.
Yes.
Without South Africa, we would not be having the new OAU,
Yes.
we would not have NIPAD, we would not have the structures that have helped to stabilize the continent in a manner that we are now the fastest growing population on Earth. We are also the fastest growing economies on Earth. Whether we are able to control our resources is another matter, but as economies, we are growing. That is the role of South Africa. South Africa in Mandela and Thabo Mbeki in 2000 defined the new Pan-Africanism from where Jomo Kenyatta, George Padmo, E.B. Du Bois left it in the 1940s. For them, it was, nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and socialism. The Mbeki said no. They didn't say no, but they redefined it in a very clever way without disturbing the rest of the continent. That we'll have nationalism is okay, we'll have Pan-Africanism, but we are going to have economic liberalism. And that's what China was also doing. So we embrace the market as Africans. And it is without Thabo Mbeki as a thinker, and I'm paying a special tribute to him,
Yes.
because he carried us all as Africans on his wings, and he paid the price for it. The 2008 Xenophobia were directed on Thabo Mbeki's presidency, and that's the first time. And you could hear in the streets, Sia Papa, basically saying, we are hopeful because Msolozi, who is that time the uncle, in the left wing of the thing, no names, was basically the one they were supporting. They were saying, we are hopeful because Msolozi is coming. And Thabo Mbeki was basically chased out of the office, and he was told he will go away with his Africans. And true, he left South Africa almost physically, and he lives on the continent, like everybody else. In conclusion, one has to say the following, that the leadership in South Africa is not Pan-African. And I'm saying this because I am sure somewhere the current president will watch. And I worked under him for 3 years, because he was the chief of the International Crisis Group. He was the point man in South Africa. But the division between those who fought from the African soil and those who fought from inside South Africa, they are that ideological divide. And both of them have fought for ANC's control. Currently, ANC is controlled by the insiders.
The trade unionists.
Not just the trade unionists. The trade unionists were part of it.
Yeah.
But there are those South Africans who have never stepped on the rest of Africa, who, when they are coming to Nairobi, they say, I am going to Africa. Yeah. Yes. Or when they come from South Africa, where did you get, I bought this in Africa. That's how they talk about.
Terror.
Yeah. And that is the leadership now in control of that continent. Now, and they have
me as a Somali who's coming
and they have literally kicked out.
To Kenya.
They have literally
really bad citizen.
displaced from politics the Pan-Africanist. Begin to imagine that within the government of South Africa, there is the most powerful lady is a wife of a Kenyan.
Yeah.